The shuttle broke through Eos's upper atmosphere at 0340 hours, and the first thing Commander Lisa Varek noticed was the silence on the radar. No orbital stations. No traffic control ping. No automated weather satellites cycling their little bureaucratic hellos into the void. Just static, and beneath the static, the planet turning as it always had, indifferent, enormous, green-blue and cloud-swirled like a bruise healing in reverse. She kept her hands on the manual controls, even though the NAV system could have handled re-entry. She needed something to grip. Cloud covers thinner than the briefing said, Corporal Davin Ossie observed from the co-pilot's seat. He was 26, broad-shouldered, and had a habit of stating obvious things in a tone that made them sound like wisdom. Lisa had learned to appreciate it. In the field, obvious things said aloud kept people alive. Should have visual on Halvarin City in about 4 minutes. I know. She adjusted their descent angle by 2 degrees. Check your seals. Behind her, she heard the team running their pre-drop checks. Sergeant Mara Tull's methodical click-click-click as she cycled through her weapon systems. Plasma carbine, sidearm, the wicked ceramic blade she kept strapped to her left thigh. Dr. Van Uddery's muttering to himself as he organized his scanner array, his voice dropping into the focused murmur he used when he was genuinely frightened and trying to pretend he was merely focused. And then Specialist Roke, silent as always, doing whatever Roke did when no one was looking, sharpening something, probably. Or praying. Lisa had never been able to tell the difference. 2 minutes, she said. The clouds parted and Eos opened beneath them like a wound. She had grown up in the eastern continent's hill country, 300 kilometers from Halvarin. She had learned to walk on Eos's red clay paths. She had eaten its fruit, the pale yellow ones that grew near the water, whose name she couldn't translate into any language other than the one her mother had spoken. She had watched its triple moons rise over the Calden Sea and thought, as children think, that this was simply what beauty was. That all worlds must look like this. She had not been back in 11 years. The city, from altitude, looked almost intact. That was the first horror. The buildings still stood. The grid of streets still made its rational human geometry across the coastal plain. The harbor was there. The university dome caught the dawn light and scattered it in the familiar starburst pattern she remembered from every postcard her father had ever sent. If you didn't know, if you were just a pilot on a routine approach, you might have begun composing your landing request, might have been reaching for the comm already. But no lights. In the gray pre-dawn, Halvarin should have been glowing. 2 million people generated a certain luminescence that was almost biological, almost like the city itself was a living thing exhaling warmth. There was nothing. The streets were dark. The windows were dark. The harbor, which should have had running lights on at least a dozen vessels, was a black mirror. God, Davin said quietly. Just the one word. Lisa said nothing. She brought them in low over the northern residential districts and watched the streets slide beneath the shuttle's belly cams. No bodies. That was the second horror. The briefing had prepared her for mass casualties, for the visible evidence of slaughter. But the streets were empty. Whatever the Vexery had done in those 9 hours, they hadn't left the dead lying where they fell. They had taken them. Or they had taken them somewhere. She didn't let herself finish the thought. She set them down in what had been Halvarin's secondary spaceport, a smaller facility on the city's western edge, used mostly for cargo and private craft. The main port had been hit. She'd seen the craters from altitude, 3 of them, perfectly circular, the kind of damage that came from Vexery graviton charges rather than conventional munitions. But the secondary port's landing pads were clear, and more importantly, the surrounding structures were still standing, which meant cover, which meant she could get her team on the ground without leaving them exposed on open tarmac. The shuttle settled. The engines cycled down. The silence rushed in to fill the space the noise had left. Full kit, Lisa said. Weapons hot. Uddaries, I want atmosphere readings before anyone unseals. Already running. Fawn's scanner hummed. He was a small man, narrow-faced, with a kind of careful precision in his movements that came from years in xenobiological research. He handled his equipment the way surgeons handled instruments, as though the objects themselves were capable of being offended by carelessness. Atmosphere is nominal. O2, nitrogen, standard Eos composition. No biological agents detected. No radiation above background. He paused. No vexillary energy signatures in immediate range. Define immediate. 2-kilometer radius. Beyond that, the scanner resolution drops off. All right. Lisa unsealed her helmet, took the first breath of EOS air in 11 years, and felt something in her chest do something complicated and unwelcome. The air smelled like rain and like the particular mineral quality of the planet's soil and like something faintly sweet that she couldn't name until she remembered. The wild flowering vines that grew in the cracks of anything paved, the ones the children called star creep, the ones her mother used to pull from the garden walls every spring and failed to prevent from coming back. The smell of them was everywhere. The city was already beginning to reclaim itself. 9 days. 9 days and the star creep was already coming back. She stepped down the ramp onto the tarmac. The others followed. Roke went wide immediately, taking a position behind a collapsed cargo loader, his long-range rifle up and his eye at the scope. He was the quietest person Lisa had ever commanded, a specialist recruited from the border recon units, thin and dark and extraordinarily still in the way of people who had spent years learning that stillness was survival. He communicated primarily in hand signals and the occasional complete sentence that arrived, when it arrived, with the weight of something that had been considered thoroughly. He signaled, "Clear, near perimeter." Mara came up beside Lisa, carbine at low ready, her dark eyes moving in the quick systematic pattern of someone who had been trained to see threats before they fully formed. She was 10 years older than Davin, 10 years harder, with the particular competence of someone who had survived enough things that survival had become something like a philosophy. Which way? Lisa looked at the city, at the dark streets and the standing buildings and the absence of everything that made a place inhabited. The briefing flagged anomalous energy readings in the Civic Center district. Subsurface readings. We go there. She paused. But first we move through the residential blocks. I want to see. Mara looked at her. Just for a moment, something moved across her face, not disagreement, but awareness of what the word see meant when Lisa said it. The understanding that this was not entirely a tactical decision. Copy that, Mara said. And that was all. They moved out into the city of the dead. The residential blocks of Halvarin's northern district were a particular kind of quiet that Lisa had no prior experience of and no framework for. She had been in combat zones. She had been in abandoned stations and derelict ships and the blasted aftermath of vexillary raids on frontier outposts. Those silences had texture, the drip of ruptured pipes, the settling of stress structures, the distant animal sounds that moved in once the humans moved out. This was different. This was a silence that felt intentional, felt maintained. The buildings were undamaged. That was the thing she kept returning to, kept worrying at like a loose tooth. No blast scarring. No broken windows. No burned-out vehicles in the streets. The vexillary had come here and done something to 2 million people without, apparently, breaking a single pane of glass. Davin paused in front of a residential tower and pointed. On the front steps, a child's shoe. One shoe, small and red, placed, not dropped, placed, neatly on the second step from the bottom. The laces were tied. No one said anything. Lisa made herself look at it for a full 3 seconds, then looked away. In the next block, a cafe, its door standing open, tables still set. Cups on tables. On one table, a half-eaten pastry that had gone gray-green with mold. Whatever had happened during breakfast, or something had been interrupted before breakfast could be finished. The chairs were not knocked over. The cups were not shattered. Someone had been sitting here, had stood up, and had walked out the open door, and the coffee had gone cold and the pastry had molded and 9 days had passed and no one had come back to clear the table. They walked out, Finn said, scanning the cafe from the doorway. He stepped inside carefully, scanner tracking. My readings suggest the population density in this block went from normal to 0 in approximately, he checked his display, 40 minutes. The biological traces suggest ambulatory departure. They weren't carried. They walked. The vexillary herded them, Mara said. It wasn't a question. Or called them. Lisa stepped into the cafe. Picked up one of the cups. Cold, long cold, the residue of coffee dried to a dark ring at the bottom. She set it back down. The vexillary have acoustic systems. We know that. We don't fully understand the range of frequencies they can generate. You're saying they could have, what, broadcast something that made 2 million people just walk. I'm saying I don't know. She set the cup down carefully. I'm saying there are no bodies and no damage, and that means whatever happened here was controlled. The Vexery were being careful. She looked at the molded pastry, at the open door, at the empty street beyond. And the Vexery are never careful unless they're protecting something. She turned and walked back out into the street. The others followed. Above them, a bird, the first living thing they'd seen, crossed the pale sky in a long wobbling arc and was gone. The Civic Center district occupied Halvern's geographic heart, a cluster of government buildings, the central library, the main university campus, and the great plaza that the locals called the Bowl. A circular public space 300 meters across whose tiled floor depicted a map of the known galaxy as understood at the time of Eos's founding, now beautifully, hopelessly out of date. They found the first Vexery excavation site at the Bowl's eastern edge. It was not subtle. The paving had been removed, not broken, removed, lifted and stacked in neat interlocking piles at the perimeter as though by a contractor who intended to return and relay it. Beneath the paving, the substrate had been extracted to a depth of approximately 15 meters, the walls of the resulting pit perfectly smooth, the surface of the exposed earth below bearing a faint iridescent sheen that Finn immediately crouched over and began scanning with the focused attention of a man who has forgotten to be afraid. Vexery boring tech, Mara said, eyeing the smooth walls. I've seen this before. Border station on Keleth. Same finish. Different scale, Roke said. He was standing at the pit's edge, looking down. It was the most words he'd said since the shuttle. Lisa glanced at him and found his face, usually unreadable, carrying something that might have been unease. She crouched beside Fun. What are you reading? Something I don't have a reference for. He tilted the scanner, frowned, tilted it again. There are energy traces in this excavated material that don't match any Vexery technology signature I'm aware of. The resonance pattern is... it's older. Much older. He looked up at her. The Vexery didn't create what's down there, Commander. They found it. Lisa stared into the pit. The iridescent sheen on the soil at the bottom caught the morning light and scattered it in patterns that were almost regular. Almost like script. How many sites? She asked. Briefing said 7 within the city perimeter, Davin answered. He was checking his datapad, pulling up the aerial survey imagery the intelligence team had compiled from drone passes 3 days ago. But look, he turned the pad toward her. 7 sites, yes, but not randomly distributed. They formed a pattern. An arc. The arc, she realized after a moment, pointed toward a specific location beyond the city center. A location about 2 kilometers south, where the land rose toward the base of the Calden Ridge. They were sampling, she said. Moving in from the perimeter, taking cores. Triangulating. Triangulating toward what? She traced the arc with her finger. Where the lines would converge, if extended, a point on the ridge's lower slope, unremarkable on the satellite imagery, covered in the native forest that the early colonists had been careful to preserve. An unremarkable piece of hillside. We need to go there. I want to flag something first, Finn said. He stood, brushing the strange iridescent dust from his knees, and then stopped brushing and looked at his hands and carefully, methodically, began scanning them. Commander, do you feel anything? The question was odd enough that she processed it twice before answering. What do you mean? Any physical sensation. Unusual. The readings I'm getting from this material, there's a frequency component that's in the range of, he checked his scanner, certain neurological resonance frequencies. Theoretically, I want to know if anyone is experiencing anything they wouldn't normally experience. Lisa's team looked at each other. Davin shook his head. Mara shrugged. Roke said nothing, which meant no. Lisa opened her mouth to say no as well. And stopped. There was something she had been attributing to emotion, to the weight of being here, in this place, in this particular kind of grief, something she had been treating as psychological response to an overwhelming environment. A low, almost subsonic awareness. Not a sound, exactly. More like the memory of a sound, or the anticipation of one. A pressure she felt not in her ears but somewhere deeper. In her sternum. In the bones of her face. She had felt it since they landed. She had assumed it was grief. "No," she said. "Nothing." Fun looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. She held his gaze steadily, and after a moment he nodded and looked away. They moved on through the city. At the university, they found the second evidence of what the Vexery had been doing in the hours before the colony's silence. The Xenoarchaeology Department, a modest facility, primarily focused on the study of Eos's pre-colonial indigenous species, the small burrowing creatures called Dulvan that the colonists had thought were merely animals until the discovery, 30 years ago, of their rudimentary symbolic language, had been accessed. Not broken into. Accessed, with a precision that suggested the Vexery had known exactly what they were looking for. The files were gone. Not the physical files. The holographic display terminals were intact. The data storage units were present. The data itself had been extracted, copied or deleted, with no way to know which without deeper forensic work than Fun Scanner could manage. But they had missed something. Mara found it, because Mara looked at things the way she did everything else, systematically, without assumption. In the back of the department specimen room, behind a rack of Dulvan bone samples, in a storage drawer that had been half pushed behind a fallen shelving unit, she found a research journal. Physical paper. Handwritten. The kind of affectation that some academics maintained as a form of protest against institutional surveillance. She brought it to Lisa without comment. Lisa read it standing in the specimen room while the others maintained watch. The journal belonged to one Professor Asha Corvin, senior xenoarchaeologist, and the entries ran back 3 years. Mostly dry academic notations, the day-to-day record of someone cataloging Dulvan artifacts and cross-referencing them with broader colonial geological surveys. But the final entry, written 4 days before the Vexery arrived. The resonance mapping is unambiguous now. The structure beneath the ridge is not geological. I have been saying this for 2 years, and the university has been saying the readings are instrument error, and I have been wrong about instrument error before, but I am not wrong about this. The formation at depth, 3.2 kilometers, by my most recent triangulation, is artificial. It predates the Dulvan by at minimum 40,000 years. It predates, as far as I can calculate, every species we have catalogued in this sector. What is it? I don't know. My instruments can detect that it is there and that it is generating a low-frequency signal, has always been generating it, presumably, which means we have been sitting on top of it for 140 years and simply didn't have sensitive enough equipment to notice. I've submitted the findings to the Colonial Science Authority. I expect they will be ignored. Someone, though, should know. Something is down there. Something very old. Something that is, in a way I can't quite articulate, awake. Lisa reread the final word. Awake. She closed the journal. She looked at the specimen room's window, at the dead city outside, at the sky above it in which no satellites circled and no ships flew. The Vexery didn't come here to destroy this colony, she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised to find it steady. They came because something called them. The same signal this professor detected. The same signal they came to find. She tucked the journal into her pack. And whatever it is, they didn't retrieve it. They left. Why would they leave without it? Davin asked. Roke spoke. Because they were afraid of it, he said. And again he said nothing more, and again the sentence arrived with the weight of something that had been considered very thoroughly. The sensation in Lisa's chest was stronger now. She didn't tell anyone. She walked at the front of the formation, as she always did, and she put one foot in front of the other through the beautiful silent streets of the city where she was born, and she breathed steadily through the persistent pressure in her sternum, and she told herself it was grief. She was half Vexery. Her mother had been a Vexery defector, one of the vanishingly small number who had ever crossed the line between the Vexery collective and human space. The physiology was close enough that the pregnancy had been possible, not so close that it hadn't been difficult, not so close that Lisa had grown up entirely recognizable as human. She was taller than most humans. Her bone density was higher. Her eyes, in certain lights, caught frequencies outside the normal human visual spectrum. She required less sleep and healed faster and had, on 2 occasions under extreme physical stress, perceived things she had no rational explanation for perceiving. The military had considered these attributes assets. She had spent most of her adult life letting them. But she had also spent most of her adult life keeping the other thing at bay, the awareness that the Vexari were not simply an enemy species engaging in territorial aggression. That whatever drove them, whatever the collective will that moved them like a vast and inhuman tide across the galaxy, it was not simple. It was not merely violent. There was something underneath the violence that she had spent 11 years refusing to think about, because thinking about it would have meant asking questions about what she was, and she had never been prepared to ask those questions. The pressure in her chest, as they walked south through the Calden Ridge foothills and the city fell away behind them, was asking them for her. The Vexari bore site on the lower ridge slope was the largest they'd found. Here the excavation had gone far deeper. The opening was 8 meters across, the shaft dropping straight down with the same uncanny smooth walls, lit faintly from below by the iridescent shimmer that they now understood was not a property of the Vexari equipment but of what lay underneath, bleeding upward through the rock. Around the site, Vexari equipment had been abandoned. Not destroyed, abandoned, which was, Mara noted, unprecedented in her experience. Vexari retreated with their dead and their gear. They didn't leave things behind. Here they had left boreheads and scanning pylons and a latticed framework that Fan identified, after considerable study, as a resonance isolation shield, something designed to dampen or contain a signal rather than amplify it. They tried to shut it up, Davin said, looking at the isolation shield. Whatever's down there was broadcasting, and they tried to shut it up. And it didn't work, Fan said. This equipment is still active, and the signal is still present. The shield is operating at maximum rated capacity, and it is, he checked his scanner, attenuating the signal by approximately 12%. 12%, Mara repeated. Whatever is down there is broadcasting with enormous power. On multiple frequencies simultaneously. Some of them are in ranges I can measure. Some of them, he hesitated. Some of them I can only infer, because my equipment isn't sensitive enough to detect them directly. Lisa stood at the shaft's edge and looked down. The iridescence rose up toward her like a slow exhalation. She could feel it on her face, on her skin. Not warmth, exactly, but something that suggested warmth the way a memory of warmth might. Something that knew what warmth was and was gesturing toward it. "We go down," she said. Mara was already pulling the descent line from her pack without having been asked. This was why Lisa kept Mara. Not just the skill, but the understanding that some things were going to happen regardless, and the best you could do was be prepared for them. They rigged the descent system from the shaft's reinforced bore frame, the Vexari equipment cooperative and sturdy under Mara's practiced hands. Rappelling order, Roke first, clearing, then Lisa, then Davin, Fan last with his scanner running continuously throughout the descent. Roke went over the edge without ceremony. The descent took 6 minutes. The shaft went down, and down, and down, through layers of rock that changed in color and composition as they dropped, through the red clay of the surface layer and the pale limestone beneath and the dark compressed shale below that, and then something else, something that didn't match any of Eos's standard geological profiles, a layer of material that had a faint blue-gray luminescence entirely independent of the iridescent glow from below. Fan noted it as he passed it and said nothing, because there was nothing he currently knew how to say about it. At the bottom, a chamber. It had not been made by the Vexari boreheads. The smooth walls of the shaft gave way, at the bottom, to something that had been smooth for longer. The chamber was roughly ovoid, perhaps 40 meters across and 20 meters high at its apex, its walls made of a material that Lisa's hand, placed flat against it, found to be neither stone nor metal but something in between, rigid, cool, with a faint vibration that she felt in her palm like a pulse. The iridescence came from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the ceiling, from the entire surface of the chamber, which was covered in it, a shifting, slow-moving luminescence that was almost a pattern. That was almost language. The air was different here. Denser. Older. The smell of it was unlike anything Lisa had ever encountered. Not unpleasant, not threatening, but fundamentally alien in a way that the air of alien planets usually wasn't, because those airs were at least the products of biological and geological processes she could categorize. This air smelled like something before those processes. Before biology. Before geology. Like the first breath of a universe that hadn't yet decided what to do with itself. "Commander," Fan said, very quietly. "My scanner is reading." "I don't." He stopped. "Tried again. The signal I've been tracking from the surface. It's not coming from a single source. It's coming from the walls. All of them. The entire structure is the signal source." "What is this place?" Davin asked. He was turning slowly, looking at the walls, and his voice had the quality of a person asking a question they don't expect to be answered. "Old," Roke said. He was at the chamber's center, looking up at the ceiling, and something about his posture, about the slight backward tilt of his head and the lowering of his rifle, suggested that he had stopped processing the space as a tactical environment and had begun processing it as something else. Something closer to awe. Very old. Lisa stood in the chamber and breathed and felt the pulse of the walls in her palm and the pressure in her chest expanding, unfolding, like something that had been held under compression for a very long time and had been waiting for the precise set of circumstances that would allow it to open. Then she heard the sound. Not with her ears. With something behind her ears. With something that sat between her ears and the part of her that understood meaning. With the part of her that was not entirely human. It was not a word. It was not a sound in any sense she had prior experience of. It was more like recognition. Like a key in a lock. But the key was something in her own blood, and the lock was the chamber, and the whole turning of it was so sudden and so total that she took a step back and sat down hard on the chamber floor, and Mara was at her side in an instant, hand on her arm, saying her name. "I'm all right," Lisa said. And then, "I'm not all right. Give me a moment." "What happened?" "Something." She pressed her hand to the floor. The vibration was clearest here. Strongest. Most articulate. It moved up through her palm and through her arm and into her chest and did something there, in the place where the pressure had been building since they landed, that felt like the resolution of a cord that had been suspended for so long she had stopped noticing it. "Something knows I'm here." No one said anything. She looked up at their faces. Mara, contained and alert. Davin, frightened but steady. Fawn, his scanner forgotten in his hands, looking at her with an expression that had moved beyond scientific interest into something more personal. Roke, who had turned from the ceiling and was watching her with those dark, still eyes. "The Vexery knew it was here," she said, thinking aloud, her hand still flat on the floor. "They came because they detected the signal. But they also knew what it was, or feared what it was, because they built a containment system before they finished excavating. And then they left without taking it." She paused. "They left because it reacted to them." "Reacted how?" Finn asked. "The way it's reacting to me. It recognized them." She looked at her hand on the floor. The iridescence seemed slightly stronger in the small area immediately beneath her palm. The Vexery carry something in their biology, some marker, some frequency, that this thing knows. That it remembers. She looked up. "And I carry half of that marker. Which means it half knows me." "And the other half?" Mara asked. Lisa didn't answer immediately. She was listening to the not sound in the space behind her ears, which had settled now from the initial shock of recognition into something steadier, something that felt, disturbingly, like patient communication. Like something very old explaining itself to something very young, slowly, carefully, in the only language it had. "The other half," she said, "is why I can hear it and the Vexery couldn't tolerate it." The horror came from below. They had not fully explored the chamber. Their attention had been on the walls, on the floor, on the luminescence and the readings and on Lisa herself. They had not, until Roke held up a fist and everyone went still and silent, noticed the additional passage. It was in the chamber's floor. A vertical opening, perhaps 1.5 meters across, into darkness that the chamber's iridescence did not penetrate. From this opening came a sound that everyone could hear, not just Lisa, a very low, very slow sound, almost below the threshold of hearing but felt as much as heard, like the building's acoustics were breathing. Like the darkness below had lungs. "How deep does this go?" Davin asked. Fun scanned. Stared at his results. Scanned again. The chamber complex extends further. Significantly further. What I thought was a single chamber it's the top of a structure. The structure extends for... He checked the display again with the expression of a man who does not trust his own equipment, for approximately 2 kilometers. Downward. 2 kilometers of ancient structure beneath a planet's crust. "That's not possible," Davin said. "I'm not interested in its possibility," Roke said. "I'm interested in what's in it." Lisa was already at the passage's edge, lying prone, her light deployed and pointing down. The beam caught the first 20 meters, walls of the same pale, luminescent material as the chamber above, and then more walls below that, and the sense of a vast organized darkness beyond the light's reach. And, at the edge of visibility, at the precise point where her light gave out, something that moved. Something that had been still until the light touched it and then, slowly, become not still. She pulled back from the edge. Put her back against the chamber wall. Her heart was doing something loud and rapid that she observed from a slight distance, the way she had been trained to observe her own physical responses. "There are other things down here," she said. "Other things," Mara repeated carefully. "In the lower levels. I don't know what they are. I don't know if they're dangerous." She paused. "I know that whatever this structure is, it wasn't built empty. The signal it's broadcasting, it's not just a beacon. It's a warning system. It's been warning people away for longer than we've been a species." "Or calling them," Finn said softly. "Or both." She pushed off the wall. Her chest was filled with the not sound of the structure talking at her, through her blood, through the half of her that the Vexery had given her without asking. "We need to find the device. The source. The thing the Vexery were excavating toward and then ran from." She looked at her team. "And we need to find it before whatever is in the lower levels decides to come up and introduce itself." "How do we find it?" Davin asked. Lisa closed her eyes. The not sound was directional. It had always been directional. She had been ignoring the direction because following it had felt like surrendering to something she didn't understand, and she didn't surrender to things she didn't understand. But she was done being principled about it. She felt the pull. East. Slightly downward. Toward a passage in the chamber's eastern wall that she now saw. Had always been there, had been there since they descended, and she was only now letting herself see it. "I do," she said, and walked toward the eastern passage. The passage was narrow and long, and the luminescence within it was different from the chamber above, less evenly distributed, concentrated in veins that ran through the walls in branching patterns that were unmistakably organic. Not organic material, Fun confirmed with his scanner, but organic pattern. The architecture of a nervous system, rendered in stone and light. As though whatever had built this place had looked at living things and decided to build the way living things built, with signals and pathways and nodes, with the logic of a body rather than the logic of a structure. They moved single file, Lisa leading, reading the not sound direction the way a navigator reads a compass bearing, feeling it shift and strengthen as they descended. Roke was directly behind her, because Mara had put him there without discussion, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough back to shoot past her if something came from ahead. The things in the lower levels had not appeared. But they could hear them. Not the not sound, not the frequency that spoke in Lisa's blood. Actual sound, audible to all of them, a slow rhythmic movement in the walls and floor that suggested weight and patience, and the kind of intelligence that is not concerned with being heard because it does not need to conceal itself. "How old?" Davin said at one point, quietly, not really asking anyone in particular. "Do you have to be before you stop being afraid of anything?" No one answered. It seemed like the kind of question that was its own answer. Lisa's body was changing. She was aware of it the way she was aware of weather, not through any single sensation but through the cumulative evidence of multiple small things. Her vision had shifted. The spectrum she was seeing was slightly wider than normal, the iridescent veins in the walls visible in higher resolution, the branching patterns of them readable now as something more than pattern. Her hearing had expanded in the opposite direction from her vision, dropping into lower frequencies, and the not sound that she'd been perceiving as something behind sensation was now simply sound. Present. Clear. Articulate. It was not a language she spoke. It was not a language anyone had spoken for longer than the word anyone had existed. But it communicated through something more fundamental than language, through the same molecular structures that made her Vexery blood behave differently from human blood, through whatever information was encoded at a cellular level in species that were old enough to have built structures like this one. It was telling her about itself. She didn't translate this to the others because she had no words for what it was telling her. She caught fragments, immensity, duration, decision. The sense of something that had waited without difficulty because difficulty required a relationship with time that this thing had long since abandoned. The sense of something that had built this structure not as a home but as a message, the way you might leave a letter for someone you weren't sure would ever arrive, and had sealed that message in the most durable material available, and had been waiting, without impatience, because impatience was another concept that required a certain relationship with time, for the right reader. The right reader. Lisa. Fun's voice, low and urgent. Your biometrics. She'd forgotten she was wired. They all were, baseline health monitoring, standard for Black Ops teams. What about them? Your heart rate is 40% above baseline. Your neural activity is, I don't have a reference point for what I'm reading. Your brainwave patterns are cycling through frequencies I associate with deep meditation or significant neurological event. A pause. You're also slightly bioluminescent. She stopped walking, looked at her hands. In the dim passage, there it was, the faintest suggestion of luminescence in her skin. Not bright, not dramatic. The same quality as the veins in the walls, present in her the way it was present in the stone. As though whatever was embedded in the walls had recognized something in her and was responding to it. Was echoing through her. That's not, Davin started. I know, she said. Does it hurt? Mara asked. Practical, as always. No. She looked at her hands for another second, then looked up at the passage ahead. We're close. The passage opened into a second chamber, and this one was different. Smaller than the first, perhaps 15 meters across, and dominated by a single structure at its center. They stood at the chamber's threshold and stared at it and said nothing for what felt like a long time. It was an object. A device. The word device was inadequate, the way the word ocean was inadequate if the only water you'd ever seen was in a glass, but it was the best Lisa's vocabulary could do. It stood 3 meters tall at its highest point, roughly ovoid in form but not symmetrical. It surfaced the same pale material as the walls but denser, more intensely luminescent. The light it gave off was not light exactly, not in the photonic sense, but an emanation that her expanded visual range was receiving on frequencies she had no prior experience of. It looked like the thing that light was trying to describe when it didn't have quite the right words. Around its base, in a perfect ring, were markings. Not scratches. Not carvings. The markings were part of the material itself, present in it the way grain is present in wood, intrinsic, not applied. They were in a script that Fun's scanner identified as having no relation to any catalogued language in human or Vexery records. They were in a script that Lisa, standing 3 meters away, found she could read. She didn't tell the others this immediately. She read them first. She stood at the chamber entrance and let the not sound fill her completely. It was no longer not sound, it was simply voice. The voice of the structure speaking through whatever it had built into her blood across whatever incomprehensible span of time separated its makers from the species they had foreseen, and she read the markings around the device's base. The translation was imperfect because it was passing through a medium, her Vexery genetics, that were themselves a translation, a descendant echo of whatever had come before. But the sense of it was this. We made the ones who made you. We gave them a frequency and told them to carry it until someone who could hear it arrived. We knew we would be long gone by then. We built this so that when you arrived, and something would arrive eventually, something that had come far enough to hear, you could send the message forward. The frequency is not a warning. It is an invitation. The ones who fear it are afraid of what they remember. The ones who carry it are ready to know. Lisa stood in the chamber and breathed. The Vexery, she said, mostly to herself, were made by whatever built this. She paused. Or their ancestors were. Something seeded them. Seeded certain frequencies into their biology and let them propagate forward through evolution, waiting for the chain of inheritance to reach someone who had also inherited the human capacity for. She searched for the word. Choosing. Choosing what? Fun asked. She walked toward the device. Whether to activate it. Mara moved to intercept her, not blocking but positioning, close, present, ready. Not because she doubted Lisa's judgment, but because she understood that this was the kind of moment where a person needed to know someone was standing with them. What does it do? Mara asked. It broadcasts. Lisa stood before the device. The light from it moved across her face and hands, moving through her skin with the quality of recognition, the way light moves through something that belongs to it. The signal this structure has been generating for however long, that's the preliminary signal. The beacon. Whatever it was calling was listening on a different frequency. She placed her hand on the device. The not sound became, for one overwhelming moment, everything Every frequency, every layer of the message it had been waiting to deliver, condensed into an instant of totality that she felt in her teeth and her spine and the marrow of her bones and the center of her chest where the pressure had been building since she landed on the planet of her birth. This is the full broadcast. And it uses the same biological key that the Vexari carry. The same one I carry. She looked at her team. At their faces. At Mara's steady eyes and Davin's fear that was not quite fear anymore, that was becoming something closer to acceptance. At Fun, who had stopped pretending to be unafraid and was simply standing in his fear with the dignity of a person who has decided that fear is not disqualifying. At Roke, who had unslung his rifle and leaned it against the wall and was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face, something entirely unguarded. I don't know what it broadcasts to. I don't know what responds. A pause. From the lower levels, the sound of enormous movement, slow and deliberate and getting no closer, as though whatever was down there was also waiting. As though it had been waiting longer. What do you think? Davin asked. She thought about the professor's journal. Something is down there. Something that is, in a way I can't quite articulate, awake. She thought about 2 million people who had walked out of their breakfasts and into whatever the Vexari had needed them for, to clear the site, perhaps, to remove the interference of human biology from the area of activation, because the Vexari had gotten this far and had understood this much and had then been unable to complete the circuit. Because the circuit required something the Vexari alone did not have. Because the makers of the Vexari had built in a failsafe, a check, had required, for the broadcast's activation, a consciousness that had inherited the Vexari frequency but had also chosen, freely and with full awareness of the unknown, to press the key. Had required someone who was afraid and did it anyway. She thought about the child's shoe on the second step. About the coffee drying to a ring in its cup. About the star creep coming back through the cracks in everything. She pressed her hand fully against the device. The light was not painful. She had expected pain, had braced for it, had set her teeth and squared her shoulders against the anticipated violence of whatever happened when you activated something that ancient, something that the Vexari had fled from, something that had been waiting in silence for longer than her species had been walking upright. She had expected to be overwhelmed by it. Instead, it was expansion. Her awareness moved outward from her body the way light moves from a source, not losing itself but extending, reaching, filling available space without depleting what remained at the center. She was still in the chamber. She could still feel the cool material of the device under her palm, could still hear Mara breathing beside her and Fun's scanner emitting its soft, continuous note and, from below, the slow, enormous movement of whatever waited in the deep structure. She was still herself. She was also, for the duration of the broadcast, something larger. The signal went up through the structure the way the iridescence went through the walls, through every vein and pathway of the ancient nervous system they'd been walking through, ascending through 2 kilometers of stone to the bore shaft and through it to the surface and then up, through the atmosphere of Eos and into the dark where it spread without limit at a velocity that physics, as Lisa understood it, should not have allowed. As though the device operated on principles that had been established before physics had been given its current form. As though it was transmitting on the frequency of something older than physics. The message went out. Lisa felt it go. Felt the structure exhale, finally, after its incomprehensible weight. Felt the release of it as a physical thing, a loosening in the walls around her, in the floor beneath her feet, in the very air of the chamber, as though the structure had been under tension for so long that it had forgotten what ease felt like and was now, for the first time, at rest. The light dimmed. Slowly. In stages. The intense emanation of the device decreasing from totality to presence to a quiet, steady glow. Still there, still bright, but no longer overwhelming. Still talking, perhaps, but finished with the thing it had most urgently needed to say. Lisa took her hand from the device. She was shaking. She noted this with the same slight distance she used for all her physiological responses and identified it as acceptable, as the body's reasonable response to unreasonable experience, and let herself shake. Mara put a hand on her arm and she let that too. Is it? Davin started. Done, Lisa said. Or started. I'm not sure which word is right. What did it broadcast? Finn asked. His scanner was running at maximum sensitivity, and his face was the face of a man whose instruments are telling him things he will spend the rest of his life trying to understand. I'm reading. The signal went, the full-spectrum signal went out, and it's still going, propagating outward. The structure is still transmitting on the lower frequencies. It's like the full broadcast primed the lower signal, amplified it. I know, Lisa said. Do you know what it said? She thought about how to answer this. What she had felt during the broadcast was not translatable into words. It was a message that used the medium of consciousness rather than the medium of language, and the meaning of it was not propositional but experiential. She had felt it the way you felt a piece of music, or the way you felt the moment of understanding after a long confusion, not as a series of statements but as a state. It said, "We're ready," she said finally. Whatever the makers of the Vexery were waiting for, whatever they seeded their descendants to wait for, through however many millennia of evolution and war and expansion, they were waiting for the moment when the chain of inheritance was long enough and complicated enough and had mixed with enough other things to produce something that could receive the message and choose to send it forward. Something that was them, and also not them. Something new. Us, Davin said. Not exactly. Something like the meeting point between them and us. She looked at her hands. The bioluminescence was fading. She was returning, gradually, to the ordinary version of herself, or what would now have to be called the ordinary version, since she suspected the experience of the last few minutes had made certain things permanent that had previously been optional. Me. Specifically. Silence in the chamber. From below, that slow movement, still not ascending, still waiting, but differently now. The quality of the waiting had changed. It was no longer the waiting of something that didn't know when its moment would come. It was the waiting of something that knew the moment had come and was now calculating what to do with that fact. We should go up, Mara said. Yes, Lisa agreed. They ascended. The climb was harder than the descent, the rope, the long shaft, the changing layers of rock, and Lisa's body, which had been running on adrenaline and expanded awareness, was returning to itself with a thoroughness that made her arms shake on the rope and her lungs burn. Mara climbed directly below her the entire way up, which was tactically suboptimal and personally what Lisa needed more than she would have said out loud. They emerged from the shaft into the morning light of Eos, which had warmed while they were underground, the sun now well up over the Calden Ridge, the native forest throwing long shadows across the bore site and the stacked paving stones and the abandoned Vexery equipment. The air above ground smelled different than it had before, or Lisa's expanded perception was receiving it differently, the star creep and the mineral clay and the distant salt of the sea all present with a clarity that was almost painful. Fun was running his scanner before he'd fully cleared the shaft. Running it, stopping, running it again, staring at the display with the expression of someone who has moved past the point where surprise is a useful response to information. The Vexery isolation shield, he said. It's still running. Still attenuating the signal. He paused. It's not making any difference. The broadcast is propagating regardless. The lower frequency signal is stronger than before. Measurably, significantly stronger. As though the full broadcast, your activation, cleared a kind of static. The signal was always there, but now it's clean. It's pure. And it is going very, very far. How far? Davin asked. I don't have an instrument that can track it, but... He gestured upward, at the sky, at the implicit beyond of it. Very far. They stood for a moment in the morning light on the slope above the ruined city, 5 small people who had descended into the deep past and come back with news that they didn't yet have the language to report. Lisa looked out over Halvarin, the dark windows, the star creep coming through the pavement, the harbor's black mirror, and felt the weight of it, the grief of it, which had not gone anywhere, which had merely been waiting beneath the pressure and the expansion for her to return to it. 2 million people. The child's shoe on the step. The coffee drying in the cup. She would find out what had happened to them. Whatever the signal had started, whatever vast response was now moving through the dark toward this planet, she would find them first. She made herself that promise as a private thing, between herself and the city she'd grown up looking at from a distance of 300 kilometers, in the language of the yellow fruit she'd forgotten the name of. We need to call it in, Mara said. We need to. Davin was checking his scanner's comm relay. Wait, I'm picking something up. He looked at the display. His face changed. Lisa looked where he was looking. On his display, the tactical overlay that tracked Vexery ship signatures, the overlay they'd been monitoring since they entered the system, which had shown no Vexery presence in the EOS sector, was updating. Multiple contacts. Many multiple contacts. At the system's edge, at the outer sensor threshold, at the precise boundary where normal space met the faster-than-conventional transition that Vexery drives used. Vexery ships. Hundreds of them. Every Vexery ship in range had stopped moving. Lisa stared at the display. The contacts were motionless, not decelerating, not maneuvering, not doing any of the things ships did when they were taking up combat positions or withdrawing or making any of the ordinary decisions that ships made. Just stopped. Holding their positions at the system's edge in the complete, absolute stillness of things that have received a message that has required the immediate suspension of everything they were previously doing. Complete silence. Then, slowly, one by one and then all at once, a mass movement that resolved on the display as a single unanimous turn, they changed heading. Every Vexery ship in range. All of them pointing their prows toward the same point in space. Toward the star that Eos circled. Toward this system. Toward this planet. Directly toward Eos. Lisa looked at the display for a long moment. Then she looked up from it, over the heads of her team, over the ruined city and its dark windows and its returning vines, up at the bright morning sky of the world where she was born, which was, she now understood, precisely where she had always been going to end up. She had not known, until this moment, whether what the device broadcast was an invitation or a summons. She still didn't know. She thought about the markings around its base, about the translation that had moved through her blood. The ones who fear it are afraid of what they remember. The ones who carry it are ready to know. The Vexery were coming. All of them. She breathed in the smell of Eos, the clay, the salt, the star creep, and waited to find out which one they were.